YouTube, welcome to channel Anna Bella, and today I'm going to be reviewing Little Women, the 2019 film that came out Christmas time, Boxing time. It's based on the book called, obviously, Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, who was an American author. She wrote it in 1869. And it had a huge impact both in the UK and in the USA when it was released, because it was the first book that actually looked at the domestic setting of women. And 2 points. One, I was very disappointed that they didn't mention the whole corset thing, because wearing a corset was compulsory. You had to wear one. If you didn't wear one, you were considered a loose, fallen woman, i.e. a prostitute. That's basically it. And also another point that I want to make is the fact that one of the reasons why the Little Women are seen to have so much freedom during the novel is the fact that they are effectively parented by one parent who is a nurse, who is helping with the Civil War female relief effort that is happening all across the United States during the Civil War. And obviously their father is fighting in the war. So that's why it is a unique piece of literature, because it shows the freedom that women actually had. And at this point in time, there wasn't universal education for boys and girls, so a lot of girls actually were educated at home. And it's quite interesting that when Amy gets the hit on her hand, Mr. Lawrence across the road approves of Amy being at home educated, saying that that's the proper way of doing it. And it kind of becomes between Ma and Mr. Lawrence. They take on to educate all of the children, including Laurie, who is a boy. So it's sort of like Laurie gets his extra Latin tuition, but he also gets what the girls get, which is maths, English, theatres, plays, writing in the newspaper, doing parts in their plays, as well as physical education, which basically involves ice skating and doing other stuff with Joe. Which is interesting. What is interesting about how the film is done is it does not start with the normal Christmas opening. It starts very differently, and it starts at the end of the book, because one of the biggest problems that you have when filming Little Women is you have a very young Amy all the way up to a certain point where she grows up, and then you have to change the actress, as did happen in the Winona Ryder adaptation and Kristen Bale adaptation, which is beloved for many reasons, but one of the things I really liked about this adaptation is they kept the same actress all the way through. And I know it was difficult because you had sort of 13-year-olds feeding dolls and so forth, but that's how it was. People were younger, they acted younger for longer. And it's interesting that they kept Laurie a boy, because when Christian Bale's character in the Christian Bale version of Little Women, he goes to Europe, he becomes very manly and very adult quite quickly, whereas Laurie, you can still see, yes, he's drunk, but he's basically a lazy teenager doing so. He's still a little boy in man's clothing. He's not yet a man in his own right, and that's quite different to how Christian Bale played it. Also, another point that is worth pointing out is I actually like the fact that you were going from the future to the past, from early adulthood to childhood. I enjoyed that. Some people didn't. Admittedly, you did have to remember the book whilst watching it, and sometimes it did feel a bit like a tick list. But what I really liked is each girl, so we've got Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy, the three daughters, and then Laurie's the next door neighbour. And what was really nice is each one of those characters had their own character arc and were valued very separately, and that's one of the things I really liked. I liked the fact that they pointed out that Amy paints and draws, Jo writes, Meg is quite interesting because she was the only sister that was officially introduced into society, and it's quite telling because it clearly was that Meg was Aunt Marge, their aunt's companion, until it became apparent that Meg had to go and earn some money. So then Jo took over, but Meg still got introduced in society, because we're talking about people who are in genteel poverty. So these are basically middle class people who have fallen on hard times because of the war, and it's a way of keeping their standing. And Mr. Lawrence helps them out purely because, not out of charity, because they're the same level as he is. So he wants to keep up the standards. And it's interesting that though all of the girls had their individual talent, Beth who's into music, Meg is quite interesting because you never really see what her individual talent is, and she's more of an all-rounder. Yes, she did enjoy her acting, but she was just playing at it. She had really absorbed the lessons that Aunt Marge had actually given her, and you could really tell. And then Amy, when she gets sent away due to scarlet fever that Beth contracts, she really absorbs those lessons to the full extent of how how the aunt would have liked Meg to have been, and that is interesting in itself. I really enjoyed the film. I really liked it. I liked the ending, actually, the fact that you couldn't tell whether Joe had married the professor. But also another point that's well worth pointing out, and this is due to two things. One, the Harvey Weinstein scandal and the whole Me Too movement, but also the age of the professor. They made his age younger, so you didn't have a 40-year-old going out with sort of a 19-year-old, which I thought was interesting, and made it more appropriate for now, because there'd be no way that would be acceptable now for a 19-year-old to sort of date a 50-year-old. That would kind of be like sugar daddying, which just as kind of jars, but obviously in their time it would be acceptable. But actually it's what Joe needed. Joe was too intelligent for the boys her age. She was not conventional, but actually she was fairly conventional when you look at it. And I really like the ending, the fact that they had this unisex co-educational school where you had boys and girls learning fencing, art, literature, drawing, painting, music. So you had all of the talents coming through, and that's one of the big things that Little Women actually does, is it celebrates, one, having a well-rounded education and developing your talents and within yourself, and two, having good character, good moral character. And it was interesting that they actually had a scene that said, well, in today's world, moral character just isn't popular, hence why you had those penny dreadfuls, that shocking stories that Joe was writing for, because people just wanted something to entertain them, not to preach at them. And that's interesting in itself. Little Women is a good story. It does have a lot of sort of feminist leanings, and actually it does, even though I was disappointed about the lack of corset debate that Marmee has, but actually it did round Marmee's character, I found, and actually showed that she wanted to be with her girls, but actually she had to do other things. She said, no, they'll be fine, they will cope, I have to be here because this is the national crisis we're in. And also another point that I think is really well developed is the fact that they tackle what marriage was like. You have Meg, who says that marriage is an economic contract during this time period, so people married to keep the wealth within their family and to keep their daughters wealthy, because women could not inherit at this point. And it's interesting that Amy makes that point. She says, well, I could marry a man, but then he'd own me and my children would be his children, and therefore I'd have to live off his living allowance. So a weird way it would be like a kept woman, only not a kept woman, because in the past people did used to have mistresses that were kept, and they were regular mistresses, so they were paid like a monthly sum for their services to the gentleman. And this is an interesting way that men have sort of claimed ownership over women. Obviously being a kept woman would be a fallen woman, being a respectable married woman you would not, but you wouldn't necessarily get the same financial payment each month from your husband. He could just say no. And it was interesting that they developed the relationship between John Brooke and Meg, and the issue of the dress and how important it became. And it did show you middle class genteel poverty of what it is. It's sort of like, either we get the new dress or we don't eat for a week. The choice is ours, but what do we do? It's interesting that we saw the twins, and we did see Amy and Laurie's baby briefly at the end. I liked the ending, I liked the ambiguity of it. It also showed the importance of the printing press, and it was interesting that the publisher's daughter said, we want to know what happens. And it was interesting how disconnected he was from his wife's family, from his own family, and from his daughters. And it took them to basically say, no, this is an important book. Women want books about their lives that aren't necessarily, romantic adventures. They want to know how other women are living. That kind of thing interests them. How do women cope during war? What do women do? What do little girls learn? And things like that. And that is really interesting, particularly during this time period. Hope you've enjoyed this review. Yes, it's been kind of short, but it's interesting to note that the main actress who played Jo and Laurie were both in Ladybird. That was quite good, because they already had established chemistry, and you can see that coming through. It was well thought out and well planned. It did actually, by having the structure that it had, it made the work far more adult than it has been in the past, which is good, because it does contain questions about what is female empowerment. Do women want this? Do women want that? What's the importance of it? And I like the fact that they made the professor challenging but also respectful, and actually they made him far more amenable, which was good, and I think that that's important. Overall, I'm going to give the film sort of a 4 out of 5. It was a good story, it had a good plot, and actually you did see the connections between all of them. Beth's story was brilliantly done. I love the fact that they used the beach for that, and you had the analogy of, well, you can't stop it. You cannot stop the tide going out, and you cannot stop death, and that's an interesting and important point within the novel. And it's also interesting how Beth is the wisest of them all, but that's because of her own experiences. And I mean, I really like the fact that you did see her get the courage to go over to Mr. Lawrence's house to play his piano, and him send the piano over when she got weaker. That is really good, because it just shows you that you don't have to leave home to be a strong person, and I think that that is an important message. And it also sort of highlights why sometimes people fail, because there's a lot of people dropping out of university and college and things, and that's because there's too much choice. They are overwhelmed. They're not actually making a choice, they're just bemused by choice. They're going through the motions of choosing when they're not actually choosing anything at all, and that applies both to men and to women. Overall, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. I really enjoyed watching the film. I thought it was very well acted, and I thought Meg's speech was interesting, how she said, actually, yes, I want a home and I want a family and I want to be a wife, and I thought that was good. But I also thought that Jo's argument was good, and I also thought that the ending with the publisher, where you had Jo saying, no, she doesn't need to get married, it just shows inconsistency, I will submit to this marriage just for economic gain, which kind of sums up actually the reason why a lot of women did actually marry. It wasn't because they really wanted to marry, it wasn't because they were in love. They did as Charlotte Lucas, which is a character from Pride and Prejudice. When Charlotte Lucas married the good old Mr. Collins, who was a respectable man, but she married him for her own comfort, because she knew that he would be able to provide a stable house, a stable living, and that because of Mr. Collins' personality, Charlotte would actually be calling the shots. And I think that in the past people have overlooked the fact that women did have a tendency to marry very silly men, not because they loved them, but because that they could control them, and that they were the common sense partner to them. And I think that's something that society has forgot, because we're supposed to be all romantic. Anyway, enough about that. I really enjoyed watching the new version of Little Women. I thought it added to the debate regarding women's rights, and actually by going back to the 1869, going back to that era, it actually does show you how far we as women have come. Yes, there are still battles and issues, but actually life is pretty good to be a woman, and I think that people forget that. And I think that sometimes we sort of like say, oh, things are so negative, women are getting this, women are getting that, and actually we've come a really long way, and we just need to keep going quietly and calmly and steadily, and things will improve. And also I think people have got to be sensible. Anyway, enough about that. I really liked it. Do check out the new Little Women film. It is very, very good. I enjoyed it, and I liked the ambiguity, because it actually allowed you as a reader to understand it more. A lot of people didn't like the epilogue. I kind of get why, because it is a beloved book. It would be like saying, well, Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet might have married or might not have married, which would have been very unsatisfactory. Whereas this, for Jo, I think is probably her best ending, because you're not quite sure whether they just employed the professor or whether she married him, and I really like that. 4 out of 5. Please like, comment and subscribe, and Happy New Year to you all. Bye bye.